Before we dive in, I want to make it absolutely clear. This video is for educational and informational purposes only. The experiences I'm sharing are true accounts and not endorsements or recommendations to try any of these substances. Please, if you're watching, do not attempt to recreate these dangerous and unpredictable trips. Viewer discretion is advised. Some drugs open your mind, others trap it in a waking nightmare. You've probably heard of psychedelics like LSD or shrooms, but what if I told you that some of the most terrifying trips come from substances you'd never expect? We're talking about Benadryl, Datura, and even inhalants like gasoline. Not exactly what people think of when they hear getting high, but these substances don't just distort reality, they shatter it completely. Unlike psychedelics, these drugs don't just make you see weird visuals, they make you hallucinate full-blown people, creatures, and conversations that feel 100% real. And once the trip starts, you're stuck in it for hours, sometimes even days. From shadow people watching you from the corners of your room, to talking with friends who aren't actually there, to waking up covered in scratches with no memory of what happened, these aren't just bad trips, they're real-life nightmares. Today we're diving into some of the scariest trip reports from people who took these bizarre substances and barely made it back. Let's begin. The first drug we are covering today is diphenhydramine, also commonly taken as Benadryl. Did you know that tens of thousands of people are addicted to one of the most dangerous and harmful drugs in the world? Surprisingly, this drug is an over-the-counter allergy medication that you likely have in your home right now. Diphenhydramine, also known as Benadryl. What is diphenhydramine? DPH is an antihistamine and anticholinergic most commonly sold under the brand name Benadryl. It works in the brain by blocking histamine and acetylcholine receptors. At regular doses, this isn't a significant concern. It relieves allergy symptoms and can cause mild drowsiness. However, at much higher or recreational doses, it becomes problematic. Acetylcholine is vital for many bodily processes, including memory and muscle control. When these receptors are excessively blocked, users can experience severe side effects, such as urinary retention, dehydration, dry mouth, memory impairment, confusion, and dysphoria. Around 10 p.m., I took 675 milligrams, with 200 milligrams left in my pocket. I hadn't eaten for 2 days. By 11 p.m., I had lost my mental clarity. I found myself lost in a forest in downtown Vancouver, which is already surreal, but I thought maybe a bad trip would scare the addiction out of me. I had a small water bottle and a knife, and I had set my phone's background to "It's not real" to remind myself. However, my phone died shortly after my last post, and I haven't seen it since. Around 11:30 p.m., I lost all sense of time. Everything felt like it was drifting. The trees seemed to whisper, and I felt insects crawling on me, but nothing was there. Small sounds made me jump. When a guy walked by and asked for a cigarette, I nearly had a heart attack. His face looked disfigured, like it had been burned off. I tried to say no, but what came out was a slow, audible, "not it." As I heard drunken men yelling in the distance, I kept my knife at hand, later finding small wounds on my thigh from accidentally hitting it. I tried to sit down, feeling 200 pounds heavier, but saw insects crawling everywhere and stood up again, forgetting why I had gotten up. The men kept yelling insults at me, which I thought would stop if I took more DPH, so I attempted to swallow the remaining pills dry. I could hear their footsteps approaching, but I felt paralyzed and unable to run. I would walk in one direction, only to see a tall shadow figure, and then walk another way, ending up in bushes. I felt blind, my vision blurry, but I could hear voices coming from all directions. When I heard my name, it was the voice of my deceased mother asking where I was. I tried to respond, but my mouth felt paralyzed. Eventually, I felt an intense sense of impending doom and collapsed. I felt completely paralyzed, looking to my side and seeing a massive spider approaching me. When I looked back, my heart raced. I genuinely believed I was dying. After this, everything became hazy, and I felt like I was drifting in and out of consciousness for hours. When I finally regained awareness, it was daylight, and I was on the ground, still seeing flashes and black spots. I realized I had lost my phone and knife. I walked for a couple of hours and found myself near a hospital. When 2 police officers approached me, they could tell I wasn't okay, and I admitted myself for help. Now that I'm home, all I can think about is when I'll take Benadryl again. The second drug we are covering today is gasoline. Yes, you heard that right. People actually huff gasoline fumes to get high, and the effects are nothing short of terrifying. Unlike psychedelics, which alter perception, inhaling gasoline slams your brain with a toxic rush that causes intense dizziness, confusion, and hallucinations. Many users report seeing shadow people, terrifying creatures, and even having full-blown conversations with people who aren't there. But it's not just hallucinations. Gasoline fumes can cause severe paranoia, memory blackouts, and sudden aggression. Some users experience out-of-body sensations, hearing distorted voices, or feeling like time itself is broken. And the worst part, it's highly addictive and destroys the brain with every use. People who have tried it say the high feels like a nightmare they can't wake up from. And for some, they never do. When I was 14, my cousin, who is now essentially a living ghost, convinced me that huffing was only dangerous when people ingested the chemicals, which he naively claimed made the air safe. He insisted that the reason people say huffing is bad is that they do it incorrectly. He filled a plastic bag with a propellant room deodorizer, then poured out the liquid that pooled at the bottom. He argued that most people either leave the liquid in the bag or inhale directly from it using a shirt or rag. Then, he took a deep breath from the bag and exhaled. I watched as his eyes glazed over, his facial muscles twitched, and drool began to pool. About 10 minutes later, he came to, raving about how much he had just tripped balls. He claimed to feel great, asserting that his technique of dumping out the liquid kept him and his friends perfectly healthy. Looking back, I realized he was lying to me. Unfortunately, I was naive and believed he knew something I didn't about a drug class I was unfamiliar with. I tried his method. I can't recall how I felt, but I know I really enjoyed it. I remember spending the rest of the day huffing with him until the can was completely empty. I convinced myself I enjoyed the effects, even though the only real effect was blacking out and waking up face down in drool, clutching a bag. I don't remember a single moment of the high. The only thing I clearly recall is the excruciating headache and the night of vomiting that followed. You'd think I would want to stop after that, but the next morning, I craved it intensely. My cousin assured me that this was normal for first-time users. I told him I couldn't remember anything, aside from the few minutes of euphoria between huffs and the sickness that followed. He insisted that was typical. My memory of those days is hazy, but I know I huffed with him for several days. After the second day, I stopped getting sick. And even when I wasn't actively huffing, I felt intoxicated, far more so than alcohol could ever make someone. At some point, my cousin started talking about how the best high came from inhaling gasoline fumes. But he warned that we should only try that once, as he didn't have a safe method for it. I do remember that experience vividly. We took a half-empty spare gas tank from the garage and inhaled through the spout. I was still in a stupor and wanted to impress my cousin, so I went first. I took a deep breath and exhaled. The sensation was unlike anything I had experienced before. It began at the base of my spine and spread warmth and pleasure through my body, vibrating with intensity as it traveled up my vertebrae. When it reached my head, I felt an overwhelming rush of warmth. I don't know how long I was out, but when I came to, the first thing I heard was a loud, busy signal, fading away as I shook my head to regain my bearings. I saw my cousin slumped over the gas can and, recalling the euphoric rush I had just experienced, stumbled back to the can, giggling. The following days are a blur. One major issue with using gas fumes to get high is that we still had the same amount of gas in the tank after 2 or 3 days of huffing. It became an endlessly reusable drug, and the rush was addictive. Within a week, I was a zombie. My only function to keep breathing air filtered through that can. I must have managed to drink some water because I'm still alive, but I think the last time I ate was the morning after my first use. During this time, my parents were out of town, and my cousin's mother was indifferent to his well-being. When I was finally dropped off at home, my parents immediately noticed something was off. I claimed to be very drunk, which they believed. After some shouting, I was allowed to pass out in my own bed, reassuring myself that it was no big deal and that I would return to smoking weed and drinking for fun. At 3 a.m., I woke up with a pounding headache, extreme nausea, and dry heaving. I felt sober, yet I couldn't focus my vision. Every attempt to walk resulted in dizziness. I lay in bed, crying for hours, convinced I was dying. It took 3 days before I could get out of bed and pretend I had recovered from being sick from drinking liquor for the first time. My parents still believe that lie. It took a month for the headaches and pain behind my eyes to subside. I was deeply depressed and contemplated suicide daily for the next year, only starting to feel better after gradually returning to smoking weed and spending months in therapy. I now know, without a doubt, that I suffered permanent brain damage. Inhalants are not real drugs. They don't get you high. The fleeting pleasure I experienced was merely my brain's panicked endorphin response to the neurotoxins I was inhaling. Even a single huff can lead to irreversible damage. Huffing is essentially getting high on brain damage. My cousin and I never spoke again, and we never will. His mother dismissed his withdrawal from life as typical teenage angst, unaware of the truth. I tried to reach out to him a few times over the next couple of months, but he never answered the door. Eventually, his mother had to work a second job, leaving him alone all day. I blame myself for not telling my aunt to take him to the hospital when I realized he was still using and wouldn't let me in. I finally told my aunt I thought he might be smoking crack, prompting her to call 911 when she received no response. When they arrived, he was severely malnourished, literally skin and bones. He was, and still is, unable to speak or move coherently. He never recovered, and the hardest part for me is that my aunt blames herself. If I had just told my parents the truth that night, they would have reacted appropriately, and my cousin might still have a life. That was 8 years ago, and I still have nightmares. I feel as though his soul will haunt me for the rest of my life. Over the years, I have used many drugs, and none compare to the devastation of huffing. Take it from me. You would do far less harm to yourself smoking crystal meth all day than taking a single huff. It took me 3 hours to write this, and I did not do it for my own sake. There is no such thing as a safe inhalant. They all create euphoric effects at the cost of destroying your brain. I have to live with this terrible lie forever. I am a grown man, and I still break down in tears when I remember how I felt after being poisoned, imagining my cousin trapped in a similar hell. He is unable to speak or even use the bathroom independently, a prisoner in his own mind, doomed to pray for death. Please don't use inhalants. They are incredibly harmful. If you haven't learned from this story, or others on my channel, understand that nothing good comes from inhalants. As this report illustrates, even one huff can ruin your life. When it's safer to smoke meth, you know you should avoid huffing at all costs. Additionally, I had to copy and paste this story into my Google Drive document because the original grammar and structure were so poor that I needed to fix it. It took me about 10 minutes just to make corrections. The author never capitalized the word I except at the beginning of paragraphs and made many spelling mistakes. If this story doesn't convince you to avoid inhalants, perhaps the way it was written will. And the third and last drug we are covering today is Datura, a plant so dangerous, even experienced drug users fear it. Unlike most hallucinogens, Datura doesn't just make you see things. It traps you in a waking nightmare. The hallucinations feel 100% real, making it impossible to tell what's fake and what's actually happening. Datura is found in many parts of the world, growing wild in North America, South America, Europe, and Asia, often in dry, open fields, roadsides, and even gardens. It looks like an ordinary plant with trumpet-shaped flowers, but every part of it is extremely toxic. Users report talking to friends who aren't there, lighting invisible cigarettes, and even seeing terrifying shadow creatures watching them from the darkness. Some experience hours or even days of complete delirium, waking up in strange places with no memory of what happened. But the worst part, there's no euphoria, no joy, just confusion, fear, and paranoia. Many users describe it as the closest thing to losing your mind. And in some cases, people under the influence of Datura have wandered into traffic, disappeared into the woods, or even harmed themselves without realizing it. I have experimented with psychoactive doses a few times, and I can assure you it is not a pleasant or safe experience. While I have microdosed with it in conjunction with other entheogens, I am uncertain if I will ever again attempt a full psychoactive dose. What follows is a recollection of my last experience, which lasted at least 16 hours. Please note, I am not recommending Datura. The intensity of the experience can make you forget you're even on a trip. You become fully immersed and must occasionally remind yourself that you ingested a plant. The best comparison is being in a dream without realizing it until you do, and then you realize there is no waking up. Prior to my trip, I fasted for 24 hours and had 2 trip sitters take non-psychoactive doses of Datura to align with my frequency. I meditated deeply all morning, seeking protection for myself and asking for a guardian for my trip sitters. We smudged the house and then drank the tea I prepared. Each sitter consumed about 10% of the brew, while I drank 80%. From memory, we used 9 flowers, but this was many years ago, and I cannot recall every detail. As my trip began, I was struck by an intense lethargy. I lay in bed, stretched a little, and noticed some distortion in my surroundings. Deciding to take a walk downstairs, I approached the lounge room, only to find a naked, eerily thin woman with bluish skin smoking a cigarette where the door frame should have been. Her waist was about 20 centimeters in diameter, and her long, straight black hair hung down to her breasts, completely obscuring her face. I stood in awe as she reached for the non-existent doorknob, her hand morphing into it as she held the door shut, telling me I could not pass. I had a conversation with her, but the details escaped me. Looking around, I realized that these strange women were guarding every door in the house. Despite this, I remained calm and walked into the kitchen, where I was met with a sight I can never forget. There were 10 to 15 fairies, about 10 centimeters tall, flitting about with beautiful, colorful wings, leaving trails of fairy dust. They appeared to be laughing, moving kitchen appliances, opening cupboards, and smashing plates in a cheeky manner. I thought I had to tell my housemate, one of my trip sitters, about this. His room was down a hallway from the kitchen. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed something black in the corner and went to investigate. As I approached, I heard sobbing. The black shape turned out to be a hunched figure, an elf-like creature with green skin, clad in black robes and a witch's hat. She was in tears and pleaded for help. In my youthful naivety, I panicked and ran to my housemate's room, banging frantically on the door. I realized one of the doorkeepers was blocking my entrance, and after some pleading, she finally let me in. To my shock, my housemate was not there. Instead, a gigantic black figure loomed over his bed. I quickly shut the door in disbelief and looked back toward the kitchen, seeing the pleading elf and the fairies, which sent me into a panic. I opened the door again, and the figure on the bed rose. It was a massive hellhound. I shut the door once more, looked back at the kitchen in panic, and opened the door again. This time, the hound stepped down and locked eyes with me, its piercing blue, misty gaze sending chills down my spine. I remembered my intention to manifest a guardian for my housemate and his girlfriend, which calmed me, albeit slightly. I decided to run down the hallway through the kitchen, where the lounge room connected via the dining room, which had no doors. Upon entering the lounge, I felt an unexpected calmness. There, on the floral-patterned couches, sat 5 entities resembling demons. Pale, bony figures with no eyes or nose, but large mouths filled with razor-sharp teeth and snake-like tongues. They were stuck to the couches with a transparent cling film that mirrored the couch's floral design. I couldn't tear my eyes away from them, which sent me into a complete panic. I bolted for the front door, hoping fresh air would help. Big mistake. When I opened the door, I found not my street, but a mystical forest filled with the sounds of magical creatures. Instead of embracing it, I thought, this isn't happening, and quickly closed the door. Turning around, I froze in fear. Before me stood a powerful entity, almost regal in nature. She seemed to embody death, looking as if she had died from being hung, drowned, and burned simultaneously. Terrified, I fled up the stairs, but halfway up, I experienced intense vertigo and fell to my knees, crawling desperately as I glanced back. She was at the bottom of the stairs, staring directly at me. Unable to stand, I crawled frantically, feeling her presence move closer. I thought, this is it. I'm doomed. Yet, as she approached, I was suddenly enveloped in a bliss and peace that is hard to describe. It was lovely. I began to understand that she was the same entity encountered by others on Datura, sometimes forming relationships with her. Some speculate she represents Atropos, the Greek goddess of death, after whom the tropane alkaloid atropine is named. I reached the top of the stairs and looked into a large mirror. My reflection stepped out, walked into the bathroom, and I followed. However, I cannot recall what happened next. I returned to my room to lie down and stared at the ceiling, which was swarming with strange bugs weaving intricate webs. These strands transformed into tiny stars that grew larger and exploded into colorful fractals. I glanced over at my desk and saw my housemate and his girlfriend there. Relieved, I thought the trip was wearing off. But when I turned back to my wardrobe, something felt off. I looked back at my housemate, only to find he had vanished, along with his girlfriend. I realized it had only been a few hours. The trip was just beginning. From that point on, I remember only fragmented moments. My housemate later told me he had been with me the entire time, even though I couldn't see him. Apparently, I had been naked, conversing with imaginary beings and inanimate objects, speaking in tongues that were not English but sounded like another language, not quite gibberish. For at least a week afterward, I experienced blurry vision. If I ever choose to use a psychoactive dose of Datura again, I will approach it with more openness and engagement with the entities. However, this experience is not recreational and should never be done in public. It requires at least one trip sitter and must be approached with preparation and respect for the plant. This is not for the faint-hearted. It is neither cool nor fun, and it can lead to hospitalization or a stay in a psychiatric ward.